South Africa. A country with a turbulent history. The European colonization. Apartheid. And Nelson Mandela, the visionary leader who laid the foundation for the South African society today. South Africa. Past, present, and future.
South Africa was first discovered in 1487 by the Portuguese explorer Bartholomew Dias. 12 years later, another Portuguese explorer did the same, but it was not until over a century later, before the European settlement of South Africa began with the aerial of the duty Navy commander Jan van Riebeeck in 1652. They needed a supply station for the ships en route to the Southeast Asian countries. South Africa was the ideal place for such a base.
As the years went by, this small supply station grew into a colony. And as the colony expanded, the Dutch began to take the land and the cattle from the local black tribes, and the tribe populations were enslaved or killed. The Dutch occupation lasted until 1795, when the English invaded. South Africa was now divided into two parts: a Dutch area in the north and center, and a British area in the east and south. The British gained total control over the land when they won against the Dutch in the Second Boer War in 1902. 7 years later, in 1909, the British Parliament made the South Africa Act. This gave South Africa its independence from Britain.
To ensure the continuation of the white minority's domination over the non-white South Africans, non-whites were stripped of several rights with the introduction of new laws like the Native Land Act in 1913, which restricted the blacks the ownership of land. This ultimately led to the beginning of apartheid.
Apartheid is the Dutch word for living apart. It was a system of racial segregation that governed South Africa for nearly 50 years, and was specifically aimed to protect the domination of white South Africans over non-whites in every aspect of life. But it was also economically motivated. A cheap workforce was needed, particularly to work in the country's gold mines.
It formally started in 1948, but separating the non-whites from the white minority had long been a policy aim. It was a continuation of injustices already happening. Laws made white people officially superior in every aspect of their lives. Living or doing business in white areas was banned, and since they weren't technically citizens of South Africa, they couldn't vote. Non-whites also had to carry a pass at all times that showed which race and township they belonged to, and had to obey strict curfews. If they didn't, they would be arrested and thrown into prison, where they were beaten and forced to do slave labor.
There were separate public facilities. Transport, schools, parks, and libraries were all segregated. Education were also divided. The state set up separated education systems for blacks that received a fraction of the funding that white schools did. And mandatory education ended at only age 13 and was structured to funnel blacks into labor work.
People were classified into 4 racial categories: white, black, Indian, and colored, which were people of mixed race. Non-whites were divided into 10 homelands based on tribal groups. They were all separated into different residential areas in homelands called townships. Different townships were established for each of the races. The daily life in a township was full of hardships. The townships were often crammed with people, therefore a lack of accommodation was common. Many houses were built on illegal property, and since they did it without the permission of the government, they couldn't access the proper services like sewage, clean water, electricity, and roads. Without those, life became very difficult for them. Their houses were small and square, they were often called matchboxes, and there were often more than one household in each house. Homelands were scattered throughout the country. They were overcrowded and lacked jobs, forcing blacks to seek jobs as migrant laborers. Wages were low and it was illegal to strike.
There were 148 apartheid laws. Interracial marriage was banned. Many had no right to citizenship and were regarded as aliens in major cities. But resistance grew. In 1960, a huge peaceful protest against past laws ended in a massacre at Sharpeville. 69 people were killed. The deaths created a public outcry, radicalizing liberation movements like the African National Congress, also known as ANC. Out of these struggles came Nelson Mandela.
Nelson Mandela was born on July 18 in 1918 in an African village located in South Africa's Cape Province. He grew up tending herds, but at the age of 7, young Mandela was sent to the local Methodist school by his mother.
When he was about 9 years old, his life changed forever. His father died, and his mother sent him to his guardian at the Great Place Palace, where he lived alongside his guardian's son and daughter. He began to go to church every Sunday, and as Christianity got a bigger part of his life, he started studying English, social, geography, and history at a Methodist school near the palace. After that, he attended Clarkbury Boarding Institute to complete a junior certificate. In 1937, he began studying at the Methodist College in Fort Beaufort.
When he finished college, Mandela began working on a Bachelor of Arts degree at the University of Fort Hare. However, at the end of his first year, he was suspended because of his involvement in a students' representative council boycott against quality of food. In 1943, Mandela began studying law at the University of Witwatersrand, and at the same time, he became a part of the ANC. The people in ANC liked him, and as times went by, he became one of their leaders.
After the Sharpeville massacre, the ANC turned to new tactics. They were now going to use more direct methods to counter the apartheid system. Nelson Mandela was one of the masterminds of many sabotage missions.
They targeted vital infrastructure, like power plants. These missions were intended to cripple the infrastructure and force the government to meet their demands. In 1956, Mandela was arrested for treason and thrown into prison, where he would spend the next 27 years of his life. However, protests and sabotage missions continued despite the absence of Mandela and many other ANC leaders. Open conflict erupted in the 1980s, with anti-apartheid activists frequently shot at, beaten, or arrested. Mass protests were firmly put down, but little by little, the apartheid establishment crumbled.
In the late 80s, the anti-apartheid movements in the United States and Europe were gaining support for boycotts against South Africa, for the withdrawal of US firms from South Africa, and for the release of Mandela. In addition, the economic sanctions imposed by Western countries around the world were having a significant impact on the South African economy. South Africa was becoming an outlaw in the international community.
In the year 1990, the National Party government took the first step towards dismantling discrimination when it lifted the ban on the African National Congress and other political organizations. It released Nelson Mandela from prison after 27 years serving a sentence for sabotage. A negotiation process followed. The government repealed apartheid legislation, officially ending apartheid.
South Africa held its first universal election in 1994, where Mandela won by an overwhelming majority and became the first black president of South Africa. The ANC has been in power ever since.
From a turbulent history, South Africa has emerged in the last decade as a leading nation in both Africa and the world. Its borders have opened to a flood of tourists who come to enjoy the country's stunning natural beauty and vibrant culture. But moving South Africa past its apartheid culture has not been easy. The country still wrestles with significant racial issues.
There's a lot of difference between the rich and the poor people. Rich suburbs where many of the rich people live have risen significantly. In the rich suburbs, people often live in big mansions with a lot of luxury, such as swimming pools and having security guards, while millions of black people still live in townships with just as poor conditions as before. Most of them are unemployed and uneducated.
Poor people keep moving to the cities, but a lot of them can't afford the houses or apartments in the cities. So instead, they've built their own towns outside the major cities. These towns are known as squatter camps. Their houses are made of poor materials from the scrapyard, which is against the law. There is a lot of violence and people easily get diseases because of the bad sanitary conditions.
One of South Africa's biggest problems today are HIV and AIDS. 4.7 million people are HIV positive, and an unknown number have AIDS. Every day, around 1,500 new people get infected with either HIV or AIDS, often because of the bad conditions in the townships and squatter camps.
South Africa is one of the world's leading mining and mineral processing countries. It's the world's third largest exporter of coal and a major producer of cobalt, copper and iron ore. It has developed a lot in the recent decade, both economically and culturally. But the country is still healing from the apartheid era, and the government has plenty of work to do before the problem of large-scale poverty will be resolved.
Così si keleli Afrika, malu pagani su ponolwayo, Israel mitanda zoyetu, Così si kelela tina, lusa polwayo, Murena bulu kase chabasa Yesu Ufedi se intwale matwenye Usebuluke si chabasa